Hello, my friends. My name's Timothy Nelson. I'm the Artistic Director of InSeries, and we have just completed the first project in our 2020-2021 all-virtual season, which is A Fairy Queen, a 4-episode podcast opera, as far as we know, the first of its kind in the style inspired by classic radio dramas of the early 20th century. I'm going to give you an introduction today to the piece, to the process, to the decision that went into opening with this, and all the amazing artists who were involved in making it and what that was like. But first I want to say just a word about why it was important to me during the pandemic that we not cancel our original plans to open the season with A Fairy Queen, and that we find a way to go through with this. A Fairy Queen is based partly on Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream is a play that premiered in the same year as Romeo and Juliet. It was a year of great creative might in the life of Shakespeare and the writing of Shakespeare, and it's important for us to know, for us to remember today, that this was the year that the theaters reopened in London after having been closed because of a pandemic. Romeo and Juliet and A Midsummer Night's Dream, maybe even more so, is Shakespeare saying the theater is going nowhere. The theater remains. The theater is important, and it is the thing for which we live, that gives life a purpose. To me, it felt wrong that in this year, knowing that the piece had that message at its core, that we cancel this production, and then instead we find a way to do it that would still speak to audiences, perhaps in a new and more meaningful way. So what is A Fairy Queen? A Fairy Queen is originally a stage production that I created in 2016 for a festival in Bath in the UK called the Eifford Festival. 2016 was the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death. All around the world, there were celebrations. Opera houses in particular were producing many works based on Shakespeare. Of course, the Verdi's, Macbeth, Othello, Falstaff. There was a production at one festival of Mendelssohn's A Midsummer Night's Dream. There was the Britten Midsummer Night's Dream all around. There was the Thomas Hamlet. It was a season full of Shakespeare. Nothing could make me happier. And for this celebration, I partnered with the Eifford Festival in Bath to create a new version of Purcell's The Fairy Queen called A Fairy Queen. Now, what is Purcell's The Fairy Queen? The genesis of opera is a very interesting thing, and it's very much related to national ideas of culture upon the continent and also in the UK. Opera is invented in the very end of the 16th century in Italy. It took a very particular form in that early genesis, in that it was invented by poets, aristocrats, lawyers. It was what we would call court drama, but not in the sense of the British court or the French royal court, but which was a proper king with a largesse and a sovereignty that expanded much more than the Italian principalities. Opera is sort of invented in Florence in 1598. The second opera is in 1600. The first opera that we generally think of as still performed is the Monteverdi Orfeo, which was premiered in Mantova for the Mantovan court in 1607. That's a very particular style. It's through sung, and it was an attempt to recreate Greek drama. They thought, now we think wrongly so, but they thought Greek drama was through sung, and they were trying to invent a style of performance that replicated all of the Renaissance and the regermination of classical forms, Greek drama, and they invented opera. Now, as always happens when ideas, philosophical ideas collide with commerce, in Venice, when opera became something that could be sold, it took a different form. So even in Italy, there's court opera, there's Venetian opera, which has a very clear 3-act structure, whereas classical court opera in Italy has a 5-act structure. And then that form of opera gets transported to France. The first French operas in the French court were by Cavalli, an Italian, Venetian Italian, and they sort of merged the classical court drama with the Venetian commercial drama, and the tastes of the French. The French did not like the castrato. The castrato was replaced with a high tenor called the haut cant, and French court opera that we now know as Lully, Charpentier, eventually Rameau, becomes the norm in France. In the UK, things were a little different because England had a tradition of commercial spoken theater that far exceeded any tradition of the same sort in Italy or in France. Shakespeare, Marlowe. This form and the industry which produced it was very established by the advent of opera in the late 17th century. So much so that the British never really took to the idea of people singing for 3.5 hours without any speaking. The English theater, early modern theater style, had already broken with the Aristotelian principles of the unity, so that every play has to take place in 24 hours. There's a unity of time, a unity of place. It has to take place in one place, and a unity of action. It's one storyline. Well, Shakespeare had very much done away with that. So those values were very different in the court, and in the UK and in England, they never really accepted the idea of through-sung opera until the 18th century, and even then it was Italian opera. There are a few examples like Venus and Adonis by John Blow and the very famous Dido and Aeneas, but these pieces are about an hour in length, even less. They were written for the court, we can be sure. Even Dido and Aeneas, which we know there was a performance at a girls' school, but Josiah's priest school for girls. But most certainly it was a court piece first, and it was of short length. What happened in the late 17th century in the UK is they invented a form which they called dramatic opera or semi-opera. What these entertainments were popular dramas, rarely new dramas, existing dramas often by Dryden or by Shakespeare, and they inserted into these dramas musical interludes between the acts that were more or less somehow connected thematically, but they were also totally separate dramatically. So the actors never performed in the interludes, the singers never performed in the spoken drama, they were not characters in the drama. The music were more what we would consider a mask or a intermedi. This was the case with The Fairy Queen, which was a version. The English tradition of performing Shakespeare or Dryden, classic theater in general, was to adapt it freely for the tastes of the time. So as we discussed when we did the Verdi, the Viva Verdi based on King Lear, up until the late 19th century, the performance that took place of King Lear had a happy ending. And this was the tradition to change these pieces. The Folger Library here presented a late 17th century version of Macbeth a couple years ago, which varied in some pretty spectacular ways from the text we know, which we consider original, of Shakespeare. This was also the case with the Shakespeare that became the 5 acts of The Fairy Queen, and inserted into those acts were 5 intermedi. Now, in the case of The Fairy Queen, these were connected slightly more thematically than would have been the case with a lot of the other semi-operas. Henry Purcell, the composer, is certainly the most acclaimed and the greatest practitioner of writing semi-operas, which also included King Arthur, which is still performed in some way. The Indian Queen, which was recently made into a fabulous production by Peter Sellers, and Diocletian, a number of these works. The Fairy Queen is the most famous of these, partially because of the music. It comes quite late in Purcell's career. Purcell died very early, at 35, I think, but The Fairy Queen represents the musical high point of his writing, and also, of course, because A Midsummer Night's Dream is such a beloved and famed play that is so much a part of our dramatic lingua franca. The Fairy Queen contains these 5 interludes. Each has a theme. One is the seasons, one is the journey from night to day. The final one is takes place in a Chinese garden with what they imagined were Chinese people singing Chinese music, and there are these more masks, and they're generally the characters are fairies. In that way, it's a bit connected with Midsummer Night's Dream. But again, the singers did not take any role. Titania did not sing, and the actors took no role in the intermedi. This is difficult for a modern audience in many ways. First of all, these are very long pieces. They were very much about the spectacle. They featured a lot of dance music, and it's difficult for audiences today to not see turning off from the drama, watching a spoken act, and then having an entertainment, a little amuse-bouche, a palate cleanser between the acts up to the next drama, to not see that as somehow cheapening the work. It's hard for us to recreate the aesthetic that that created the context for semi-opera to exist. Also particularly problematic, of course, with a piece like Midsummer Night's Dream is the play is so seminal and so respected that it's difficult not to see any performance of music alongside it as not cheapening what we incorrectly believe to be an authentic version of the play. There can be no authentic version of the play, and in fact, Midsummer Night's Dream is the one Shakespeare's play which we have no text for. We have no original version. We don't really know what that is. In the early modern theater, that is a fallacy to believe that there even is an text. Still, it is difficult to decide what to do with this wonderful music today. There are very rarely performances of the Fairy Queen in the way that it was intended. There is a early 2000 performance, a Glyndebourne performance of the original thing. It's well over 4 hours. With the spoken characters and the interludes in the order that it was meant fully. More often, the piece is presented as a abstract wandering through music. All the text is taken out. It's just the music. It's still a good 2 hours of music, at least 2.5 hours, and some abstract, dreamlike journey through this wonderful music. Is concocted by director, or it's just presented in concert. This provides a great challenge, I think, for a director, and for a festival in the summer outside in the UK. The idea of doing Purcell's Fairy Queen, finding a way to retain Shakespeare, to make it a performance of Midsummer Night's Dream that somehow incorporated the music in a more fully engaged, thematically integrated way, provides a great challenge, and that's what I set out to do. To create a version of semi-opera in which the singers do take the spoken lines of the Shakespeare, and which the music is incorporated in a way that tells the story as well. What we would understand to be musical theater, which the blending of text and music is, of course, a very important thing to us here at InSeries. So we created a Fairy Queen instead of the Fairy Queen. This is a slight nod to the director Peter Brook, who when he created his version for piano and a few singers of Magic Flute, instead of calling it the Magic Flute, calls it a Magic Flute. It is a way of honoring that great director and a way of freeing the piece from its historical context and still containing a connection with the original. What we made is a performance in 4 acts, originally performed by 8 singers. These 8 singers take all of the roles in Midsummer Night's Dream that we've retained, and they also perform all of the music. The music is put out of order. It is deconstructed in a way that we can find storytelling in it. What I mean, for instance, is that the text of a certain piece sounds like, yes, this could be the emotion of one of the lovers of Demetrius at this moment. We'll apply it there. Sometimes we've changed the text slightly to make that storytelling feel more authentic. The other thing we've done is added a lot of other Purcell. As much as the piece is a celebration of Shakespeare, it is also a celebration of the incredible, powerful, dramatic music of Purcell, who, along with John Dowland, are really the first people to figure out how to set the English language in a dynamic and unique personal way. So the piece contains much of the music from the original score of The Fairy Queen, I would say about 90% of it. It also contains a lot of other very popular personal music that helps to tell the story. So when I say that, I'm thinking of pieces like Sweeter Than Roses, which is very famous, I Attempt from Love's Sickness, Music for a While, The Evening Hymn, O Solitude, as well as lesser-known pieces like The Fatal Hour, In the Black Dismal Dungeon of Despair. And these pieces are intermixed freely with the spoken text, which also often has instrumental underlay, an underscore that drives the piece forward. So while there's a balancing act between text and music as the propulsive elements in telling the narrative. Now, Midsummer Night's Dream is not the most simple story. And this is a very good example of Shakespeare throwing off the shackles of Aristotle and deciding he's not going to tell one story, he's going to tell several different stories at once that interweave and which comment and refract each other. For an audience, this is challenging. It's also a challenge with early operas, people know, to follow the stories. Music, and particularly in the case of A Fairy Queen, where we're using music that wasn't originally intended to tell this story, music can further obfuscate that narrative and make it confusing. So I wanted to search for a way to explore the themes, loosely the narratives of A Midsummer Night's Dream, but to do it with music, and therefore I had to find a way that that the story could be clear and have its own unique voice, not to be just, here's the play of A Midsummer Night's Dream with music interspersed. So what we did was divide out the four principal narratives. There's a fifth narrative in A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is the marriage of Hippolyta to Theseus, who are the rulers of ancient Athens, or Theseus is, and he has conquered an Amazon warrior named Hippolyta, and she is to be his bride. And it begins on their wedding nuptials and ends with the play performed after their wedding. It has become the tradition, and it might be an original tradition, that Theseus and Hippolyta are played by the same actors who also play Oberon and Titania, and the human world and the fairy world are reflected in this way. We decided to get rid of Hippolyta and Theseus and combine the role they play in the larger play with Titania and Oberon, and to make that one story, the story of Titania and Oberon. Then, of course, very famously, there are the Mechanicals, which are a group of rough and ready laborers that are going to put on a play for the nuptial ceremony. So a very famous scene of this is the Mechanicals rehearsing for their play, and their lead actor is, of course, Bottom, whose story gets intertwined with the fairies, because Bottom is discovered by Oberon, turned into a donkey-headed human donkey creature, who then is made to be the love object of Titania when a special potion is put on her eyes by Oberon. So these two stories of the Mechanicals and the fairies get interwoven. Then there is the story of the lovers. These are two pairs of lovers, Lysander and Helena, Demetrius and Hermia, and their love complication, how they get intermixed, is at the core, in a way, of Fairy Queen. And it is a trope of the early modern theater and of early opera, these sort of two pairs of lovers that get mixed up. And we know this in opera, of course, most famously from Così fan tutte. And the themes of Così fan tutte and the lovers quartet of Midsummer Night's Dream have a lot in common. And this exploration of heartbreak, of what it means to learn that life is not a fairy tale, that it's possible to love more than one person at the same time, the sort of beauty of growing up, but also the great tragic loss of youth and innocence is explored here in the same way it is in Così fan tutte. So that's the third narrative, the lovers. And the fourth narrative is Pyramus and Thisbe, the ancient myth, which is the subject of the play that the Mechanicals play. So the Mechanicals come again and embody these ancient characters and make the play at the nuptials of Hippolyta and Theseus. So for us, we divided these out, and we said, here is the first play, the Mechanicals. Here is the second act, the fairies. Here's the third, the lovers. And here's the fourth, the play, which is Pyramus and Thisbe. And to this we put a conceit, which is that a group of fairies, to entertain themselves, will perform over 4 nights these 4 different stories. So we have a prologue in which we meet the fairies. Then we have night the first, the Mechanicals. Then we have night the second, the fairies. Then we have night the third, the lovers, and night the fourth, the play, and then an epilogue. That's the structure of the piece. The device by which it is hopefully made more clear than had we just done the play in its original order. And it was an attempt, again, to find clarity, simplicity in the structure so that the music could be a magnification of the themes of the piece and not a obfuscating device, making the story less clear. It had been our intention to present this as the opening production in this 2020-2021 season before COVID-19. It would have been the most complicated and challenging work for us as a company that we had produced. It has a chorus. It has 8 characters who have to speak both the Shakespeare and sing the music of Purcell. It's a challenge to find a group of singers who are able to do Shakespeare without a lot of training, because of course singers are not trained to do that type of acting, so that's a challenge. Because there's all of the underscore, there would have had to be amplification for the spoken lines that's then turned off and carefully manipulated for the sung lines. That would have been a big challenge for us technically as a company. There is a Baroque orchestra, and it's a fantastic piece. It needs wonder, it needs magic. To pull it off theatrically would have been a great challenge, and we were looking forward to taking that step as a company. When we decided in April of 2020 to become a virtual company for a year, a lot of the productions that we had planned in some way translated to a virtual environment, different environments, but something virtual. And actually it opened up a world of repertoire which we don't typically have the opportunity to perform. Bigger opera, for instance, this year we're doing a Bohème and we're doing a Pearl Fishers. But Fairy Queen, it was hard to imagine a way that this could be presented as film or as video that was still technically possible, also was still the opening of our season. No one really knows how we're going to make art in this season, and we are excited as a company to take an adventurous journey in exploring things. But right out of the bat, to make a movie of a Fairy Queen would have been a huge challenge. This is something that I personally wrestled with a lot. And one morning I awoke and thought, what about an old radio play, an audio experience? So much about this season in our community has been about exploring new technologies and how new technologies can innovate our art forms. But isn't there also the possibility that old technology or old ways of presenting the art form that have been left aside can actually speak in impactful ways now? One of the things about producing art during the COVID-19 crisis is that we're suddenly able to partner with people all over the world. So one of the challenges in doing a live performance was with a short rehearsal period and singers who aren't experienced with the Shakespeare, particularly some of the more complicated roles in the piece. How do we perform that at a high level? Suddenly, with a virtual palette to play with, we were able to engage artists from all over the world. So some of the original cast could participate. The magic could be created in in a raw, analog way, in an old-fashioned way, and the magic was sort of left in the imagination of the audience in classic radio drama, and that's something that could fit well. It has a big orchestra, as we talked about, but the opportunity to partner with existing orchestras in places that were able to gather more soon than we are able to gather here in the United States made that suddenly feasible. So we partnered with the Orchestra Het Kabinet in Amsterdam, where the virus and the regulations surrounding it are much more contained and therefore much more lax. So this orchestra could gather and record all of the orchestra music. We had some of the original cast, Jake Arditi and Lucy Page, who played the roles of Oberon and Titania, could gather in London with a team of continuo players and a small ensemble of instruments and record some of their music there. We had the wonderful Sarah Kudin, who's based in San Francisco. And then we had a set of artists in Baltimore, and we rehearsed over Zoom the spoken text. Then we had, while the orchestra in Amsterdam was recording their music, and while Lucy and Jake and the wonderful instrumentalists in London were recording their music in London, we had a group in Baltimore with singer masks on their face, which are masks which allow for singing and also distancing, and a group recording in Baltimore, and the wonderful Sarah Kudin recording on her phone while listening to us in Baltimore, in San Francisco, and then became the art of putting it together. So taking small clips, people that had recorded themselves without the instrumental track, putting it on top of the instrumental track, adding sound effects, putting things in the right order, and adapting the original script for a radio play. Of course, without being able to see, one of the challenges was how do we evoke nature? And nature, of course, is such a big part of the script of A Midsummer Night's Dream. And while it is important for us to remember that these plays had no set, that these were performed upon a bare stage, and all of the evocation of space, of atmosphere happens in the text, which is a wonderful thing about Shakespeare, but without bodies, without a way to embody the piece, how do we create a sense of place, a sense of time, a sense of action? We then partnered with the wonderful John Search, who is familiar to in-series audiences. He performed in Viva Verdi and would have been our Spar Fucile in Rigoletto, which we had to cancel because of COVID-19. He has a double life as the classical music presenter for WBJC, the classic radio station in Baltimore. We reached out and partnered with the station and with him and wrote a new narration for the piece and reconceived the piece as the experience of a hapless narrator, a professor of Shakespeare, who begins the work by starting a lecture on A Midsummer Night's Dream that goes horribly awry as a group of fairies arrive, and he spies them for 4 nights through the woods and tells us about his journey witnessing these 4 nights or 4 acts that they perform. One of the most wonderful things about A Fairy Queen, I think, is it asks of us and it offers us as the audience a chance to listen in a different way. That is not dissimilar from, I think, the experience of many of us at home during the pandemic. During this dark and challenging time, there have been rays of hope and rays of light, and some of those are the new ways we're able to think about diverse aspects of our life, for instance, socialization, the new ways that we can connect with people in our lives that we had perhaps not practiced before and are finding now are viable ways to stay connected. The new ways our organizations, our institutions are able to reach marginalized people, to make their work more accessible in ways they could have been doing before, but it hadn't entered into the practice. The way worship communities are able to reach out in more deep and effective ways, the members of their congregation and the people beyond their congregation. And it's very similar the way that A Fairy Queen creates an audio space that demands space making from the audience that demands a moment of quiet, a moment of taking time to reserve, to listen to an artistic experience. It also offers a chance for opera to explore what it means to be episodic. One of the things that I have really looked forward to this season was a chance to say, what about the opera experience has been so codified that it's been a bit frozen, that it hasn't allowed us to escape 2 to 4 hours in the theater with an intermission. We go to the bar, we go back in the theater, we clap, we go home. What does it mean to have an opportunity to be guests in people's homes, to let them choose when to listen, and to give them a story that happens over time? This also solves one of the challenges with the original Fairy Queen, and also with my original production of A Fairy Queen, which is that it's long. It's over 4 hours. It is hard to ask an audience. It's increasingly difficult to ask an audience to sit and to take part in that. And while there's a beautiful work to be done training audiences to be comfortable in that sort of elongated temporal experience, there's also something wonderful about not having to worry about that, about saying, here is a 45-minute act, listen when you're ready, and if you don't listen to the next act for a month, that's fine. You listen when you're ready. It is a beautiful opportunity to find new ways of making, new ways of experiencing, new ways of partnering, and new ways of being. I hope that you'll tune into all 4 episodes. I hope you'll find something that is meaningful there. I hope you'll enjoy the adventure that we are all on, and I hope that I'll see you at the theater when we're back to live performance. Take care.